It was supposed to be a day of goodbyes, but at the chapel, my phone buzzed and everything changed. I opened the message with shaking hands. "Don't trust Dad, come alone." The words hit like a fist. Around me, people wept and hugged, unaware. My son lay in the coffin and silence pressed down, but someone who knew our family's darkest alley had sent that line. I looked at my husband and saw a calm that did not belong to grief. "If you stay, I promise you will hear the rest. Please like, subscribe, and listen to what happened next." I was standing beside my son's coffin, staring at the flowers that covered the wood, trying to keep myself upright. The chapel was quiet, except for the soft sound of people crying. I remember holding the edge of the coffin because my hands were shaking so badly. My boy, my only son, was lying there cold, and I kept asking God why a mother had to bury her child. The air felt heavy, and every breath felt like a weight on my chest. I was numb, moving only because my body refused to fall in front of the guests. That was when it happened. My phone vibrated inside my purse. The sound echoed in that silent room, louder than it should have, almost rude at a funeral. For a moment, I wanted to ignore it. After all, who sends messages at a funeral? But something inside me told me to look. Maybe it was habit, or fear, or some old instinct that wakes a mother when something is wrong. I slid the phone out quietly, hiding it behind the funeral program. My eyes scanned the screen, and at first I thought I was reading it wrong. But no, the message was real. 6 words, sharp, cold, terrifying. "Don't trust Dad. Come alone." My heart dropped straight to the floor. For a second, I forgot where I was. The chapel, the mourners, the coffin, everything blurred. My fingers went cold, like I had dipped them in ice. That message, it was not spam. It was not a wrong number. It was sent by someone who knew exactly where I was, what I was going through, and what I feared. My first thought was my son. He used to send me messages like that when he was a teenager, when he needed help or wanted me to pick him up from trouble, but now he was gone. I looked at the coffin again, tears filling my eyes. The message felt like a hand gripping my heart and twisting it. Then a worse thought hit me. How did they know to text me at that exact moment? How did they know I was at my son's funeral? How did they know enough to warn me about my own husband? My knees weakened, and I had to steady myself with the pew. Across the room, my husband sat straight, stiff, his face blank. He had not cried once since our son died, not at the hospital, not at home, not during the service. He just sat there, hands folded, jaw tight, eyes dry and empty. When I saw him, a strange feeling washed over me. Something dark, something cold. It was like looking at a stranger wearing my husband's face. I read the message again. My pulse raced so fast I could hear it in my ears. The words were simple, but they carried threat, warning, and fear all at once. Don't trust Dad. Why? What did someone know? What had my son known before he died? My mind raced back to their last argument, the shouting behind closed doors, the silence afterward, my son leaving the house with red eyes and shaking hands. He had said he needed space, but he never explained what happened. And my husband brushed it off, telling me to stay out of grown men's business. Now those memories felt like puzzle pieces falling into place. I started to sweat. My fingers tightened around the phone so hard I almost cracked it. Someone, somewhere, was trying to warn me, and they were watching. The idea that my son's death might not have been just a tragic accident punched the air out of my chest. My whole body began to tremble, not from grief this time, but from fear, real fear, the kind that crawls under your skin and refuses to leave. I looked around the chapel again. Everyone was grieving, praying, comforting each other. No one seemed to notice me reading the message. No one seemed aware that my world had shifted. In 1 second, I swallowed hard and slipped the phone back into my purse. My hands were shaking so violently I had to grip the strap to steady them. I looked at my husband again. He stood up and adjusted his jacket, not even glancing at the coffin. His face stayed blank, emotionless. For the first time in our marriage, I felt unsafe beside him, truly unsafe. The message echoed in my mind, louder each time. Don't trust Dad, come alone. That was when I knew the funeral was not the end. It was the beginning. Something had been hidden from me, something dangerous, something tied to my son's death. Someone wanted me to know, but only if I came alone. My grief turned into suspicion, and my suspicion turned into a quiet, cold resolve. I straightened my back, wiped my eyes, and held onto the coffin one last time. I whispered a promise only my son could hear. I will find the truth. When the funeral ended, people moved quietly toward the parking lot, wiping their eyes, holding each other, whispering prayers under their breath. I stayed behind for a moment, watching the last handful of mourners leave. My legs felt heavy, like the ground itself was pulling me down. The message on my phone kept repeating in my mind like a broken record. Don't trust Dad. Come alone. Every time I replayed it, a new kind of pain settled into my chest. Not grief for my son, but fear that something darker was waiting behind this warning. I stepped out of the chapel and walked toward the small garden area where my husband stood talking to the pastor. I watched him from a distance, his shoulders relaxed, his hands steady, his voice calm. Too calm. A man who had just buried his own son should not look that composed. Not unless he was hiding something so heavy. He had rehearsed his expressions for days. I tried to steady my breath as I approached him. I didn't speak right away. I wanted to see how he would react before I said a single word. When he saw me walking up, he turned slowly, and the smile he gave me froze my blood. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they think they are in complete control. A smile with no sadness behind it, only calculation. He touched my shoulder gently and said, "Are you all right, honey?" His tone was soft, almost careful, but his eyes were cold, flat, and hollow. There was no real grief in them, not even a trace. For a moment, I couldn't answer. My throat tightened and my hands felt numb. I had lived with this man for decades. I knew the way he breathed when upset, the way his voice cracked when he was sincere, the way he looked when he was lying, and right now, everything about him felt wrong, not broken by loss, not shaken the way a father should be. He looked relieved. "I'm okay," I finally managed to say, even though the words came out shaky. He nodded, but I noticed his jaw tighten for a second. A small, fast movement, like he was bracing himself for something. I kept my expression plain, calm, unreadable. If he was hiding something, I couldn't let him know I suspected anything yet. He stepped closer, placing his hand on my back in an overly gentle way, guiding me toward the car. It felt wrong, forced, like he was trying to move me away from the chapel as fast as possible. I resisted just slightly, enough to see how he would react. His hand pressed firmer, his voice lowered. "Let's go home. You need rest." But the way he said it sounded more like an instruction than comfort, more like he didn't want me to stay and talk to anyone. On the drive home, he kept stealing glances at me, measuring my reactions. I stared out the window, pretending to be lost in grief, but inside I was replaying every second, the message, his smile, his tone, his strange calmness. Something wasn't adding up, and the silence between us grew heavier by the minute. Halfway home, he said quietly, "You know, our son was stressed lately. He made strange choices. Maybe he kept secrets." I turned to him slowly. "What kind of secrets?" I asked. He shrugged too quickly. "Work things, money things. People do reckless things when they're overwhelmed." The way he said it made my stomach twist. He wasn't talking like a grieving father. He was laying groundwork, planting excuses, preparing a story. I didn't respond. I didn't blink. I just watched the side of his face as he tightened his grip on the steering wheel. A man telling the truth doesn't need to prepare the ground for lies. A man hiding something does. When we pulled into the driveway, he rushed out of the car ahead of me, almost as if he didn't want to give me time alone. He unlocked the door fast, glanced inside, then turned back with that same practiced calm. "Come in, let's rest." His words were gentle, but I felt the warning beneath them. As I stepped inside the house, I thought of something my mother used to say. When people act too calm, look at their eyes. The truth hides where the face cannot lie. I looked at his eyes then, truly looked, and saw nothing but shadows. No grief, no pain, just calculation. And in that moment, I knew one thing for certain. Whoever sent that message knew something my husband was terrified I would discover. For years, I had watched my family shift in small ways that I didn't understand at the time. Looking back now, I can see the pattern clearly, but when you are living inside a storm, you don't always notice the wind changing direction. My husband and my son were never perfect together, but there was respect, or at least the surface of it. My husband liked being the one in charge, the man who made the rules and expected others to follow without question. My son, on the other hand, had always been the kind of boy who believed in fairness. He did not like secrets. He did not like lies. He did not like people being taken advantage of, especially inside our own home. As he grew older, the differences between them became sharp edges that scraped at each other slowly over time. There were arguments I overheard in the hallway late at night, quiet but tense. I heard my son saying he wanted to handle his own finances, and my husband insisting that things stay the way they had always been. I heard disagreements about the family business, inheritance, money being moved around, decisions made without discussion. My son had tried many times to bring me into the conversations, but I always believed the men should resolve things on their own. I never imagined that stepping back would become the biggest mistake of my life. There were moments, small ones, when I saw my son's shoulders slumped, his jaw tight, his eyes full of questions he didn't want to ask out loud. He would pat my hand and say he was fine, but I could see the weight pulling him down. My husband started changing too. He became quieter, but not in a peaceful way. It was a calculated silence, the kind that hides planning and control. He worked longer hours, made more private phone calls, locked his office door more often. When I asked if everything was okay, he would give short answers that revealed nothing I tried to tell myself. He was just stressed. But something in my chest told me he had crossed lines he didn't want anyone to notice. He also became very protective of certain papers, tax files, bank statements, letters I wasn't allowed to touch. After 30 years of marriage, a woman knows when something is being hidden right under her roof. My son tried to keep the peace for my sake. Whenever things got tense, he would take a walk or shut himself in his room until he calmed down. He used to talk to me after dinner, sharing little things about his day. But slowly, those conversations disappeared. He ate less. He slept less. Sometimes I saw him sitting alone on the porch steps long after midnight, staring at the road as if waiting for something he couldn't name. The distance between father and son grew wider each month, and I felt helpless, stuck between two people I loved but could no longer understand. The last year before his death was the hardest. My son tried to move out and live independently, but my husband convinced him to stay, saying it was better for the family. I didn't know then what that really meant. My husband didn't want him out of the house. He wanted him where he could be watched and controlled. My son grew more frustrated, more exhausted, more withdrawn. He tried to stand up for himself, but every time he pushed back, my husband pushed harder. Their relationship wasn't just strained anymore, it was breaking. There were money issues too. I began noticing bills addressed to my son going missing. Bank notifications stopped arriving. Hard-earned savings he had put aside for years seemed to vanish into thin air. Whenever I asked about it, my son gave half answers, as if he was trying to protect me or himself. I saw fear in his eyes, not the kind that comes from danger outside the home, but the kind that grows when you realize the danger is coming from someone you trust. My heart felt heavier each day because a mother can sense when the walls of her home are no longer safe for her child. Still, I never imagined how deep the betrayal really went, or how much pain my son had been carrying alone. I often think back on those moments now. The odd silences, the arguments, the lies, and it makes me sick to realize how blind I had been. But grief has a way of reshaping memories, sharpening the details you once ignored. Standing at my son's funeral, holding my vibrating phone with that warning message, everything clicked into place. All the tension, the secrets, the shifts in my husband's behavior suddenly made sense. My son hadn't died in a world of peace. He had died in the shadows of a truth none of us had spoken out loud. In the days after the funeral, small things began to bother me. Not loud things, not obvious things, just the kind of signs you only notice when your heart is already alert. At the reception, while people brought flowers and spoke softly, I saw my husband step away from the crowd to take a call. He spoke in a low voice, his back turned, his shoulders stiff. When I walked closer, he quickly hung up. He acted as if nothing happened, but I had lived beside that man for 40 years. I knew when he was hiding something. I also noticed he never cried. Not once, not during the prayers, not during the final farewell, not when people hugged me. He held his face like stone, like he was waiting for something instead of grieving our child. Later that night, when I was cleaning up, I found a piece of burnt paper inside the fireplace. The corner of an envelope with our son's handwriting. I knew it instantly. He always wrote the number 2 with a small loop. I held it in my hand, trying to guess what had been destroyed. My husband walked into the room at that moment, and when he saw me holding the charred paper, he looked startled. Not sad, not guilty, just startled. He took it from me quickly and said it was trash from the ceremony, but I wasn't convinced. Then there was his coat pocket. While hanging it, I felt something thick inside, a sealed brown envelope. When I reached to check, he rushed over and snatched the coat from my hands, saying, "I'll take care of it." He had never reacted like that before, not once in our marriage. It was as if he was guarding something, protecting something from me, when we were supposed to be holding on to each other. Every small detail began to form a pattern. He kept his phone locked with a new password. He stepped outside to make calls. He closed doors gently when he used to leave them open. These weren't the actions of a grieving father. These were the actions of a man who didn't want to be seen. And the worst part? When I mentioned the strange message I received at the funeral, he didn't ask to see it. He didn't ask who sent it. He didn't ask if I was scared. He simply said, "Ignore it." A father who had just lost his son should have been shaken, alert, protective. Instead, he acted annoyed, like the message had ruined some sort of plan. I went to bed that night with my stomach tight and my mind racing. Something wasn't right. My son may have died, but the truth around his death was still very much alive, and it was starting to show itself piece by piece, like a thread pulling free from a sweater. I knew then that the message at the funeral was not a mistake. Someone was warning me. Someone wanted me to look deeper, and slowly, painfully. I started to realize I might have to face a truth I never imagined, that the man sleeping in the next room, the man I had trusted for decades, might have been keeping secrets connected to the son we just buried. I didn't want to believe it, but I also knew I couldn't ignore the signs anymore, not when every small detail whispered the same thing: be careful. I could not sleep that night after the small clues kept building in my mind, like bricks forming a wall I could no longer ignore. The envelope in his coat pocket, the half-burned document, the way he avoided my eyes, the phone that never left his hand, all of it kept circling inside my head. I lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the text message that arrived at the funeral. "Don't trust Dad, come alone." Those words kept repeating themselves, louder each time, until my chest felt tight. Someone had sent it for a reason, and I knew I could not pretend it was a mistake. A message like that does not come by accident, not on the day you bury your child. Around midnight, I sat up slowly and turned on the small lamp beside the bed. The house was quiet, too quiet. Usually, even in sadness, you hear some signs of a home. Footsteps, dishes settling, someone coughing down the hall. But that night, everything felt frozen. My husband was in our bedroom on the other side of the house. I sat there listening carefully, and not a single sound came from him. I checked my phone again. The message still showed the location pin, the old family cabin, a place we hadn't visited in years. Not since the children were young. I felt a strange pull in my chest. Why that place? Why now? And who knew to send me there? I got up, put on my sweater, and walked to the hallway. As I passed the living room, I noticed my husband's briefcase on the floor. Usually, he kept it beside his office desk. Something about the placement felt wrong, as if he had dropped it in a hurry. I bent down slowly and opened it. Inside were several folders, all with my son's name printed on them in large letters. My throat tightened. I pulled out the top file and saw financial forms, court-stamped documents, and letters written by my son. Some were signed, some weren't. A few looked like copies of agreements I had never seen before. One page had my son's handwriting at the top, but the signature at the bottom was not his. I stared at it for a long time. The writing looked forced, shaky, wrong. I placed the papers back inside, careful not to make a sound. My hands were cold. I stood there for a moment, trying to breathe slowly, controlling the rising fear inside me. Something was very wrong, and the silence of the house felt heavier now, almost suffocating. I walked to the kitchen to drink water, but before I reached the counter, I heard soft footsteps upstairs. Not loud, not rushed, just steady movements. Someone trying not to wake me. My husband had said he was going to sleep early. Why was he walking around upstairs at 1 in the morning? I stepped back quietly and listened. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard a drawer open. A slow, soft pull. Something metallic shifting inside it. After a moment, the footsteps returned, moving across the floor above me. I stood perfectly still, holding my breath. I did not know if he noticed I wasn't in bed or if he was simply walking in his sleep, but the uneasiness grew stronger. It felt like I was sharing the house with a stranger. I went back to the guest room, closed the door slowly, and locked it. I sat on the bed again, thinking about the cabin, the location pin, the warning. My heart began racing again, but not from fear, from a quiet, determined certainty forming in my mind. People do not send messages like that on the day of a funeral, not unless there is danger, not unless they know something that I don't, and not unless they are trying to save me from something or someone. I checked the pin again. The coordinates pointed directly to the cabin, a place where my son used to go whenever he needed space or had something difficult to think about. It was his quiet corner of the world, where he kept his thoughts safe. If the message came from someone who knew him well, then whatever they wanted me to see, there must have been important, something he left behind, something meant for me, and maybe only me. I sat there until the sky turned pale. I waited for the right moment. Then, as the sun rose, I made a decision. I would go to the cabin. Alone, I did not take anything except my phone, my keys, and a small notebook. I left a note on the kitchen counter saying I needed air and would be back by evening. I did not mention where I was going. My husband was still asleep when I left the house, or at least he pretended to be. When I stepped onto the porch, the morning cold hit my face, but the chill running through my body came from something deeper. I knew that once I reached the cabin, I might find answers, or I might find more questions. But I also knew one thing very clearly. Someone wanted me to know the truth, and they trusted me enough to warn me that alone meant I could no longer ignore the message. It was time to uncover what my son had left behind and why someone didn't want me to trust my own husband. I drove toward the old family cabin, with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The road was dark and nearly silent, broken only by the hum of the engine and the beating of my own heart. The message from the unknown number kept flashing in my mind. Don't trust Dad. Come alone. My son had been dead for only 2 days, and already the world felt dangerous, twisted, full of shadows I had never noticed before. When I reached the cabin, the night air was cold and still. The place looked exactly as it had years ago, but now it felt heavy, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for me. I unlocked the door slowly, half expecting someone to jump out, half expecting the place to be empty. Nothing moved. The cabin smelled like dust, old wood, and something faintly familiar. My son's cologne. I switched on a lamp, and the soft yellow glow revealed the room fully. That's when I saw the box on the table. It was my son's handwriting on the lid. Small, neat letters, the same way he had labeled his school books when he was young. My knees went weak. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I didn't know whether to open it or run away from it. My hands trembled, but I forced myself to lift the lid. Inside were his journals, 3 of them. The covers were worn, the pages slightly bent, as if they had been handled many times. My throat tightened as I picked up the first one. I opened it slowly, scared of what I might find, but knowing deep inside that whatever truth my son had tried to leave for me, I owed it to him to face it. The first page hit me like a punch. Mom, if you ever read this, it means something has gone wrong. Please don't trust Dad. My breath caught. The words blurred as my eyes filled with tears, but I forced myself to keep reading. In page after page, my son had written everything he didn't have the courage to say out loud, his fears, his suspicions, things he had noticed about his father, secret phone calls at odd hours, hidden messages, money disappearing from the family accounts, conversations that stopped the moment he walked into the room. He had written about a fight they'd had just a few weeks before his death, a fight I didn't know about, a fight my husband never mentioned. My heart hammered against my ribs as I turned the pages faster, desperate to understand. My son had written that he believed someone was trying to keep him quiet. He had said there were things happening behind my back, things involving the estate, the business, and the inheritance documents. He feared that my husband, his own father, was planning something. At one point, the handwriting looked rushed, shaky. If anything happens to me, Mom, check the cabin. The truth is here. My stomach twisted painfully. I pressed the journal to my chest for a moment, trying to steady myself. My son had been scared. My son had been alone. My son had been trying to protect me, even while he was dying inside. I opened the second journal. It contained notes, dates, details of arguments, receipts of money withdrawn without explanation, copies of emails printed and stuffed between the pages. Then I found something worse, a list of numbers, bank accounts, transactions my son had traced. Some of the money had been moved to accounts under my husband's name, ones I never knew existed. My legs felt weak again. I sat down on the old wooden chair, gripping the papers, unable to believe what I was seeing. My husband, the man I had lived with for 34 years, the man I shared a home and a life with. He had been hiding things from me, and not small things, big, dangerous things. The third journal was the hardest to read. It described the last week of my son's life, his fear, his confusion. He wrote that he felt watched, followed, that someone had warned him to stay quiet, that he no longer felt safe. And the last entry, the very last words my son wrote, shattered me completely. Mom, I think Dad is planning something. Please be careful. My hands shook so violently, I dropped the journal to the floor. I stared at the cabin walls, feeling like the entire world was spinning around me. My son had known. He had tried to warn me. And someone, maybe even the person I had trusted the most, had tried to silence him. I wiped my tears, picked up every journal, every paper, every piece of evidence he had left for me. I gathered them into a bag, my hands trembling, but my mind sharper than it had ever been. Standing in that old cabin, with only the sound of the wind outside, I made a silent promise to my son. I will finish what you started. I will uncover the truth. I will not let you die unheard. When I left the cabin that night, the cold air felt sharper than usual, almost warning me that life was about to change. I drove home slowly, my hands tight on the steering wheel, my mind replaying every detail from my son's journals. His handwriting, normally so steady and confident, had been shaky on those last pages. The fear in his words felt alive. He had been trying to protect me, trying to warn me, trying to survive something much bigger than I had ever imagined happening inside my own family. When I reached home, I sat inside the car for a long time, too afraid to go in, too tired to run away. Eventually, I realized I couldn't face this alone. My son was gone. My husband was hiding something, and the text message had come from someone who clearly wanted me to know the truth before it was too late. Inside the house, everything felt wrong. The silence, the smell of the hall, even the dimmed lights felt heavy. I walked straight to the kitchen table, sat down, and opened my phone. My hands were trembling, but I forced them to stay steady as I searched for the one person who had never failed me. My closest friend and lawyer, Marjorie. She had been by my side for decades. She had seen me through sickness, heartbreak, and even the day we lost my son. If there was anyone I could trust with this, it was her. I pressed her name and listened to the long, slow ring. When she finally answered, I didn't speak right away. My breath hitched in my throat. She said my name gently, and that was all it took. The words spilled out. The text, the journals, the location pin, the strange behavior of my husband. I tried not to cry, but my voice cracked anyway. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end, but not the kind that scares you. The kind that tells you someone is thinking, planning, protecting. She said in her calm and firm voice, "Listen to me. Do not confront him alone. I'm coming to you right now." I told her she didn't need to drive at night, but she insisted, "If someone warned you at your own son's funeral," she said, "then something serious is happening behind your back. I will not let you stand in the fire by yourself." While I waited, I double-checked the locks on every door. I stood by the window, watching the driveway, half expecting my husband to return suddenly and ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. My mind kept circling around the same fears. What had my son found out? Why did he write that my husband could not be trusted? Why had someone risked sending me a message during the funeral? Had my husband done something unthinkable, or was he covering up someone else's actions? The not knowing tore through my chest like claws. When Marjorie finally arrived, she walked in without waiting for me to escort her inside. She hugged me tightly, then pulled out her notebook and asked to see everything. The journals, the photograph of the burned document, the text message, even the location pin. She studied each item with the focus of someone who had handled far too many cases involving hidden money, forged documents, and family betrayal. After nearly an hour of reading, she put the journals down slowly and looked straight into my eyes. "I need you to understand something," she said softly. "Your son didn't write these out of fear of nothing. He was scared of someone who had real power over his life." She paused and added, "And the fact that he left these here means he trusted you to find the truth." Her voice steadied me. For the first time since the funeral, I felt a small flame of courage inside my chest. She began outlining steps, how she would contact certain officials, how she would request sealed documents, how we would protect the evidence before my husband could destroy or hide anything. She told me to stay calm, to act normal, and to speak very little until she understood the full picture. "This is no longer about grief," she said quietly. "This is about protection, yours and your son's memory." We worked until nearly dawn, the two of us sitting at the table surrounded by papers, screenshots, and notes. Every new discovery felt heavier than the last. My husband had been moving money. He had been meeting someone privately. He had made changes to accounts that were supposed to be shared. The signs were all there, signs I had ignored because I still believed in the man I once married. Before leaving, Marjorie placed her hand over mine and said, "You are not alone in this. You have me, and you have the truth coming to your side. Stay strong." When the door closed behind her, the house felt less frightening, not safe, but less lonely. I knew the battle ahead would be painful, maybe even dangerous, but for the first time since losing my son, I felt something new in my chest. Not fear, not grief, purpose. I drove home from the cabin with a heaviness sitting in my chest, the kind that makes your breath come short and your mind spin in fast circles. I kept thinking about the journals, each page showing fear my son had carried alone. He had written about meetings with his father that turned into arguments, about plans he disagreed with, about money going missing from accounts that were supposed to be protected. He even wrote that he felt like someone he trusted was turning into a stranger. Reading it felt like being stabbed slowly, word by word. I held those pages tight the whole ride back, reminding myself that this was my moment. I couldn't cry. I couldn't break. I had to take control before my husband buried the truth, just like we had buried our son. When I stepped through our front door, the house looked the same as always, but it suddenly felt smaller, quiet, like it was holding its breath with me. My husband was sitting in the living room, acting like nothing had happened. The TV was on, but he wasn't watching it. His eyes were on his phone, his finger tapping at the screen too quickly, as if he was waiting for a message. I stood there for a long moment, studying him. The man I had married decades ago, the man who once held our newborn son in shaking hands, the man who once promised he would protect us. Now he sat there hiding secrets behind a calm expression. That calmness made me angrier than anything else. It felt like he was performing grief instead of feeling it. I walked to the coffee table, keeping my steps steady. I placed the journals down, slow and firm, letting the sound cut through the room. He looked up and I saw something flicker in his eyes. Not sadness, not confusion. It was more like recognition, like he had been expecting this but hoped it wouldn't come. I stood still, staring at him the same way he had stared at the priest during the funeral. Blank, distant, rehearsed. I told him everything without raising my voice. The text message at the funeral, the warnings, the cabin, the journals, the bank activity, the documents in his closet, the hidden envelope, and the missing money our son had been tracking before he died. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend himself. His face remained stiff, but I saw his jaw tighten. That was the first honest reaction I'd seen from him in months. It told me everything. He knew I wasn't bluffing. He knew the truth was no longer buried. I told him I had recordings, photos, and witnesses. He still didn't speak. The silence between us was loud, pressing at my ears like a storm waiting to break. I let it sit there because silence can be stronger than shouting when the truth is already exposed. I told him he had two choices. One, walk with me to the lawyer and admit what he had done. The financial deception, the forged documents, the manipulation he had pushed onto our grieving son. Or two, refuse, and I would let the police handle everything. I made it clear there was no room for negotiation, no compromise, no pretending I would not protect him. I would not soften the truth. He looked at me with a face that was no longer familiar. Gone was the softness I used to rely on. In its place was fear, real fear. The kind a man feels when the life he built through lies is about to collapse. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked. He tried to deny parts of it, but the proof was too strong. He tried to blame stress, business pressure, bad choices. None of it mattered. My son had died afraid and confused because of him. That was the only truth that counted. I told him I had already informed the lawyer and that she was expecting us in the morning. His shoulders sagged, the weight of consequences finally landing. Watching him break under the truth did not give me satisfaction. It only made the entire tragedy feel deeper, heavier, more painful. I didn't want revenge. I wanted accountability. For my son, for myself, and for the years of lies I didn't see. When he finally whispered that he would cooperate, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like the closing of a door that had been open for far too long, a door that had let darkness in unchecked. I turned away from him, not because I hated him, but because I refused to let him see the exhaustion in my eyes. I had been holding everything together since the funeral. I had been steady because someone had to be. Now, for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe. Slow, deep, steady, painful breaths. The kind you take when you know the hardest part is still ahead, but you have already survived the breaking point. As I walked toward the bedroom, I realized something important. This was not just a confrontation. This was a separation between lies and truth, between fear and courage, between the past and the future. I knew things would change from here on. drastically. But if exposing him meant protecting my son's memory, I was willing to walk through every painful step. Because no mother should ever have to bury her child and then bury the truth alone. What happened in the days that followed felt less like a family matter and more like the slow unraveling of a truth that had been held together by silence for too long. After I confronted my husband with the journals, the text messages, and the timeline my son had left behind, something in him changed. He didn't shout. He didn't deny it loudly the way a guilty man often does. He simply sat down on the edge of our bed, lowered his head, and began to breathe in that heavy, uneven way that tells you a person's lies have finally become too heavy to carry. I stood a few feet away, watching him, not with anger anymore, but with a kind of cold clarity I had never felt in all my years of being a wife and a mother. I realized then that fear doesn't always come from the unknown. Sometimes it comes from finally knowing too much. My lawyer, Marjorie, arrived that afternoon as promised. She walked into the house with the calmness of someone who has handled broken families before. She didn't waste time. She asked my husband for his phone. She asked him about the last night he had spoken to our son. She asked him to explain why he had been trying to access accounts that belonged to our boy. And when his answers didn't match the evidence, she simply nodded and wrote everything down. I stood behind her, silent, watching the truth being pulled out piece by piece like a loose thread from a tightly woven sweater. There was no screaming, no begging, no dramatic collapse. Just the slow sinking of a man who finally saw that the shadows he tried to hide in no longer existed. The police arrived a day later. They didn't handcuff him. They didn't need to. He walked out of the house on his own, the same house he once controlled with his voice, his presence, his decisions. I watched him step into the car from the living room window. For a moment, I felt a strange ache in my chest, not for the man he had become, but for the man he once was, the young husband who held our son in his arms for the first time and cried out of pure joy. But now, that version of him felt like a stranger. That version was buried long before our son ever was. After he was questioned, everything moved very quickly. The courts froze the accounts he had tried to manipulate. The investigators reviewed the journals. Marjorie helped file the necessary papers to protect my son's estate. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. Not fully, not peacefully, but enough to stand without shaking. My son's memory, the part of him that lived in the work he had done and the belongings he left behind, was safe, and I promised myself it would stay that way. Life inside the house changed too. The silence didn't feel dangerous anymore. It felt like a house that had finally exhaled after holding its breath through years of tension. I moved through each room slowly, touching the walls, opening the curtains, letting light fall into corners that had stayed dark for too long. Grief was still there, heavy, painful, real, but it wasn't mixed with fear anymore. It wasn't mixed with the confusion of not knowing what to trust. It was simple, clean grief, the kind a mother feels when she misses her child but finally understands the truth. My daughter came to stay with me for a few days. She cooked dinner, cleaned the kitchen, and sometimes just sat beside me in silence. She didn't ask questions. She didn't demand explanations. She simply held my hand and let me rest my head on her shoulder. For the first time since the funeral, I allowed myself to cry. Not the shaking, panicked tears from before, but slow, quiet tears that came from deep inside my chest. She didn't wipe them away. She just held my hand tighter. A week later, I walked into my son's room alone. I sat on his chair, touched the edge of his desk, and held one of his old t-shirts against my face. The smell of him, faint, old, but still there, brought a wave of memories that nearly broke me, but I didn't fall apart. Instead, I whispered, "I'm taking care of everything, my boy. I'm not letting him take anything from you again." It felt like a promise etched into my bones. The official decisions came soon after. My husband lost rights to the estate. He lost access to every account he had tried to reach. And though the investigation didn't prove direct harm in our son's death, it exposed enough dishonesty to cut him out of everything connected to our family's future. He moved out of the house permanently. For the first time in years, I slept through the night without fear of the person lying beside me. Peace didn't come all at once. It came slowly, quietly, the way dawn creeps into a room before sunrise. I learned how to make coffee for one. I learned how to sit alone without feeling watched. I learned how to speak openly to my children again, without hesitation or fear. And I learned one more thing. Sometimes the most painful truth isn't about losing someone. It's about finally seeing who they really are. My son may be gone, but his voice didn't disappear. It lived in the warning text. It lived in the journals he left behind. It lived in the quiet courage he passed on to me without even knowing it. And now, every choice I make, every step I take, is guided by the promise I whispered at his grave. I will protect what you left behind, even if I must stand alone to do it. The days after the confrontation moved slowly, almost painfully. The house felt different, as if the walls themselves were finally exhaling after holding secrets for too long. I walked from room to room, touching the furniture, the photographs, the curtains my son once helped me hang, and I felt a strange mixture of peace and heaviness. I had spent years believing my family was built on trust and shared love. Now I realized that sometimes trust becomes a habit, not a truth. I had trusted my husband because that was what a wife was supposed to do. I had overlooked distant behavior, excuses, half-truths, late nights, locked drawers, and closed doors. Looking back, the signs were there long before my son died. I simply didn't want to see them. The police contacted me often during those first few weeks. Each call reminded me that justice, even when necessary, is slow and tiring. My husband's involvement remained under investigation. They told me he wasn't innocent, but proving the full extent of his actions would take time. Still, seeing his power weaken, seeing him lose the control he held over the house and accounts for years, gave me a strength I didn't know I still had. I wasn't afraid of him anymore. Not emotionally, not financially, not as a woman, and not as a mother. My lawyer, Marjorie, guided me through every detail. She insisted I transfer the home into my sole name, freeze any joint accounts, and file protective measures that would stop my husband from making any financial moves behind my back. It felt strange, signing those papers alone, sitting at a long conference table with no one beside me. But as each form slid across the desk and I placed my hand on the pen, I felt my son's presence. Steady, supportive, almost as though he were saying, "Keep going, Mom." The grief didn't fade, but something else grew beside it. Determination. The journals I found at the cabin became a different kind of burden. Late at night, when the house settled and the silence grew deep, I reread them carefully. Sometimes I cried, sometimes I felt angry, but mostly I felt grateful that my son had left something behind. His thoughts, his warnings, his instincts. He had tried to protect me even while struggling with his own fears. That realization stayed with me like a quiet flame. It gave me purpose in the days that followed. My daughter visited often. She brought food, sat with me, helped me organize drawers that had been untouched for years. She confessed that she, too, had noticed tension between her father and brother, but didn't know how to interpret it. Together, we rebuilt the parts of our family that hadn't been poisoned by secrecy. We talked openly for the first time in years about grief, mistrust, and the future. It was painful, but healing often begins where denial ends. The town started talking, of course. Funeral whispers became neighborhood conversations. People stopped me in the grocery store to offer sympathy. Some were sincere, others simply curious. I kept my answers short, my face firm. I had no interest in gossip or sympathy. My only focus was truth, justice, and protecting what my son had left behind. The estate became my responsibility completely. I opened a scholarship fund in his name. A quiet announcement, no big ceremony, just a meaningful step. His legacy would help someone else rise, someone whose life might change because of his memory. Nights were the hardest. The house felt too large and too silent, especially in the hours when I used to hear my husband pacing or pretending to work late. But slowly, the silence became comforting. I stopped checking my phone for strange messages. I stopped second-guessing every creak in the floor. My fear faded. In its place, I found steadiness, a quiet steadiness that only comes from surviving something that was meant to break you. I began each morning with a new ritual. I brewed a small cup of coffee, walked to the living room window, and looked at my son's photograph. I didn't cry as often anymore. Sometimes I simply placed my hand on the frame and breathed deeply, letting the morning light hit the glass. I wanted him to know I was okay, even if he could never hear me. I wanted him to know I had protected his name, his truth, his memory. People often say funerals are endings. For me, it had been the beginning, the opening of a door I never wanted to walk through, but one I had no choice but to face. I learned that betrayal from someone you love does not end your life. It reshapes it. It teaches you to trust your instincts above anyone else's words. It shows you that love is not blindness, and mourning is not weakness. Strength grows in the spaces where truth finally settles. Now, when I stand at my son's grave, I don't feel empty. I place fresh flowers, brush the dust from the stone, and whisper, "I did it. I protected you. I protected us." And each time I walk away, I feel lighter. Not healed, but healing. Not victorious, but standing. The final truth is simple. Sometimes it takes losing everything you thought you knew to understand what you must protect. And sometimes the strongest justice comes quietly, through a mother who refuses to be fooled twice.